Today, we're going to dive into something really fascinating. It's about how this ancient samurai philosophy, this code for walking your own path, is being picked up and used as a pretty radical guide for rebellion in our modern world. All right, so first things first, we gotta understand the central figure here, the Ronin. What is a Ronin? Well, historically, it's a samurai who doesn't have a master. Now, according to the source material we're looking at, this was often seen as a sign of failure. But it also meant you were free. You could wander, you could walk your own path, and some of these Ronins, like the one we're going to talk about, became absolute legends. So how does this old idea connect to today? Well, this whole modern take really pulls from the philosophy of one of the most famous Ronin in all of history, a guy named Miyamoto Musashi. He actually created an ancient code specifically for walking alone. Okay, so right before he died, Musashi wrote down these 21 principles. They're called the Dokodo, which translates to the path of aloneness. The source we're examining really hones in on these first 7 here. And you can see the themes pop right out, right? There's this idea of radical acceptance, accept everything just the way it is. And then there's this really deep detachment from your own feelings with rules like do not depend on a partial feeling and never be jealous. It's basically a blueprint for seeing the world with total clarity and relying only on yourself. All right, so now let's flip this to the modern day. The host of our source material sees our world, our society, as this totally corrupt system. And it's a system that, in his view, is completely against everything that Ronin spirit stands for. He paints a picture of our political world not as a real debate, not a real contest of ideas, but as a total puppet show. The way he sees it, all these divisions we see are just manufactured. They're created to manipulate us, to distract us, and to make sure people stay under control and never wake up to the freedom they're actually losing. And yeah, this quote right here really lays out the stakes. It's raw, it's direct. For the host, this isn't some abstract philosophical game. It's a choice. A really simple one. Do you want to live a life based on your own convictions, even if it makes you an outcast? Or do you live what he calls a life of servitude? So this leads us to the central conflict he's describing. On one side, you have the people, who he says are labeled non-essential and are just pushed to comply, to go along to get along. And on the other side, you have the masters. These are the ones who, as he puts it, are always tightening the screws, just slowly chipping away at freedoms that he thinks people are just giving away without a fight. Okay, so if you have this pretty bleak picture of the world, how are you supposed to live in it? Well, this is where it all comes full circle. He goes right back to Musashi's ancient code and uses it as a literal roadmap for getting through what he sees as a completely broken system. Let's take that first principle, accept everything just the way it is. The host takes this and applies it directly to his own struggle today. He's basically saying, I see things for what they are, I've accepted life on life's terms. And then he points the finger and says everyone else is just living in a fantasy, refusing to acknowledge the control system they're in. Here's another one for Musashi that's huge for the host's philosophy. Never be jealous. Why? Because he argues it's just plain unwise. Carrying around that kind of resentment, it doesn't hurt anyone but you. So that focus on what's going on inside you, instead of always comparing yourself to others, becomes absolutely critical if you're gonna try to walk that lone path. And this quote, this is what happens when you adopt that mindset. You just detach from needing people to like you. The host fully leans into being an outcast. He's not out here trying to win a popularity contest. He's just focused on his own convictions. And that really becomes a central pillar of this whole modern Ronin idea. But look, this philosophy isn't just about sitting back and accepting things. No way. It actually leads to a really specific and pretty radical call to action. And it's all built on this idea that there are actually 2 different systems of law that are in conflict with each other. So here's the key to his call to action. He makes this super specific distinction between 2 words, legal and lawful. In his mind, legal is just man-made rules, policies, codes from what he calls a corporate state. But lawful, that's something else entirely. That's a higher law, an inherent law,
things like God's law, common law, natural rights, and he believes that stuff is above any government.
And this chart here really breaks down what that distinction means, at least according to the source. He's arguing that if you're a U.S. citizen, you're basically a member of this corporate system. You've traded away your natural rights for so-called privileges that the government gives you. But he contrasts that with what he calls an American national. That's someone who stands outside the system, who is only governed by natural and common law, and who keeps all their natural rights.
And to back this up, he actually points to institutions like Cornell Law and the Hoover Institute. He argues that they confirm his whole point, that common law is still the real, foundational law of the land, and that all these modern statutes and policies, they only get their power, their force of law, because people consent to them. And that's the key. He believes you can and should take that consent back.
So, where does all this end up? It all builds to this really powerful, very self-aware identity. The identity of a necessary outsider. Someone who's not fighting the system because they're some perfect saint, but because they have real-world experience with it.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't paint himself as your typical hero. It's the opposite. He sees himself as a product of the very same darkness he's now fighting. And he argues that because he was raised in it, because he was molded by it, it gives him a unique insight, a special kind of strength to go up against a system that most people just can't, or maybe won't, see for what it is.
And this last quote, man, it really seems to wrap up his entire belief system, doesn't it? The idea isn't that you find truth or light in being perfect or by fitting in. No. For him, the light gets in through the cracks, through the fractures in a broken system, and maybe even the fractures within yourself. So what we're left with is this really intense worldview where an ancient samurai code is being used to justify a very modern kind of rebellion. And it really makes you wonder, right? Where do you draw the line between just having strong principles and radical dissent? And maybe the biggest question of all, when does a society's outcast become its necessary conscience?